Hi, Mr. Shapiro. So I believe that the first half of the 21st century will be controlled by identity politics. I think the trend is clear considering we had the first women and orange man win party nominations. I want to know how a person who may not rely on identity politics can effectively make their voice heard over those who do.
Okay, so this is a really great question. I agree that what we've seen is the rise of identity politics on the left, and I think that there's actually a rise of identity politics on the right. It's why you see the rise of the so-called alt-right, which is an identity politics-driven group. The idea that white people need their own sort of political action group. And that's a problem to me. I'm not somebody who believes in identity politics. I think identity politics are actually evil. I don't think that you have your own interest group because of your race or your skin color or your ethnicity or any of that. So the only way to really speak to this is by going back to a message that I think we all chanted tonight, which is decency. Right? It's very easy to get tribal. People are inherently tribal. We all feel more for our families, as I said, than we do for people more broadly around us. The only way that you break that cycle is by having what they call social capital. And the way that social capital is created, the reason that I trust you, or that I trust my neighbor to babysit my kids, is because I know that my neighbor is a decent person. So if we encourage everyone on an individual level to abide by decency, then you can break the never-ending cycle of identity politics. But that actually requires stuff to happen outside the realm of politics. It requires an upsurge in civic morality. It requires an upsurge in things like people going to church and joining together as communities. It requires a real move toward people talking about how to deal with each other morally on a non-governmental level. If you do all that, you can recreate a social fabric that has been torn apart by identity politics. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Ben, huge fan, first of all. My question for you is pretty simple, and that is the Republican Party the answer for conservatism in America?
So the Republican Party is just a tool, and as we've seen in this election cycle, it's a tool that's available for anyone to take over, right? So sometimes you're going to get a conservative leading the Republican Party, and sometimes you're going to get an ad hoc nationalist populist leading the Republican Party. It's the obligation of people who are conservative like me to try and fight inside the Republican Party to change the leadership if you don't like the leadership, and talk of third parties. Very difficult structurally to put together a third party. If Trump ends up driving the Republican Party far away from conservatism in a very clear and obvious way, you will see some rumblings about a third party, because there are too many people who still believe in kind of root traditional conservatism to be thrown off by Trumpism. So it is the tool right now. Will it always be the tool? Not necessarily. The Whig Party was once the tool, presumably, and that fell away too. So things change.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. I have a question for you as a Harvard Law School graduate.
Sure.
Regarding the incident at Camp Randall, the man was asked to take off the quote-unquote noose around his head. Under the Brandenburg test, is this constitutionally able for the police to ask him to take off this rope, or is it considered free speech?
So, I mean, I assume that it's free speech under, the idea that it's not first of all, shouting fire in a crowded theater is based on a case that was Schenck, which has been debunked for 60 years. But yes, I'm not sure what the campus regulations are. There are policies that exist on campus that don't exist anywhere else in American life, and the Supreme Court has approved some of those things because there are time and space constraints. But if it's message specific, then you get into trouble. So it's at the very least, in my legal opinion, it's constitutionally questionable. That doesn't mean that I think it's a great idea or I think that it's a wonderful exercise of freedom of speech, but it is definitely questionable. Anytime there's a free speech question, I tend to lead on the side of free speech. And by the way, folks, if I'm answering to camera, that's only because there are people who are watching on the live stream, and it looks weird if I'm talking out here. So.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for taking a principled stance, criticizing Trump this election cycle. Thank you for introducing me to Harambe memes.
Well, that's his memory.
Last week, John Oliver used his show as a call to arms to support Planned Parenthood because Republicans have the House, the Senate, the White House. Do you anticipate pushback within the Republican Party if the pro-life movement tries to move forward with its agenda in the next 2 years?
I mean, this is a really good question. I'm not sure how committed Donald Trump is to, for example, reversing funding for Planned Parenthood, right? He said early in the primaries that he liked Planned Parenthood. He thought that they did some good work. It'll be interesting to see if he clashes with the new Congress over that, because clearly Paul Ryan and a lot of other members of Congress would like to withdraw federal funding for Planned Parenthood. Obviously, I think that's a good idea. I think abortion is immoral, and the idea that I'm paying for somebody else's baby to be killed seems pretty ridiculous, morally, ethically, legally to me. I think all of it's really dubious. It is definitely questionable. As far as John Oliver, We have a really bad habit in this country of taking everybody seriously if they have a British accent. And that seems to me a bad mistake. We ought to judge John Oliver by the content of his speech, not the quality thereof.
We've seen politics become more divisive and messy business, and as a result, arguably the most qualified people aren't running anymore. What would it take for you yourself to run for office? And then, do you think we'll ever get back to a time where those most qualified people want to be in politics and want to?
Well, I mean, there's always been sort of a disconnect between the right and the left in terms of qualified people going into public office. I will get to your first question. There's always been a disconnect because on the left, if you're really smart and qualified, you go into government. And on the right, if you're really smart and qualified, you go create things that help people and make millions of dollars. So what you end up with is this weird disconnect where the people who are on the Republican stage are all of sort of, with a few exceptions, they're all sort of middling IQ and not necessarily the world's greatest and smoothest orators. And on the Democratic side, you have a bunch of people with Ivy League degrees, except for this time around when you have an old crone who is going to be handed anyway. And also a loon-bag old socialist who escaped from the asylum. So this time actually bucks the cycle a little bit. And so we end up with a race between the two least qualified candidates in American history. But all that said, what would it take for qualified people to jump in? First of all, people have to learn to love the fight, especially people of our generation. We have to learn to love the fight. Okay, the fight can be fun. This idea that there was ever civility and gentility in politics, not really. There was more kind of on an open level. But the fact is that back in 1800, if you read the scurrilous broadsides being published by the Adams campaign against the Jefferson campaign and back and forth, it was pretty rough stuff. I mean, you had a guy named James Callender, who's actually a muckraker for Thomas Jefferson, writing things about how John Adams was senile and he was running around the White House throwing his wig at people. Really. And meanwhile, you had muckrakers for Adams trying to discredit Alexander Hamilton, who was on Jefferson's side, and bringing up all the issues about him having adulterous affairs and all this. So it's always been a rough business. I think that conservatives have to engage in that, and they have to like it. It's why people embrace Trump. It's because Trump actually comes off as aggressive. For all the problems I personally have with Trump morally, ethically, politically, the one thing that Trump is aggressive. And so it's going to take a new generation of aggressive conservatives. As far as would I ever run for office, I mean, honestly, in this day and age, I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm not the son or the husband of a former president. So it's a pretty restrictive group of people who are allowed in. And I'm also not one of the Trump children, who I guess are next on the list. So I'll have to blame my father if I never run for office. It's his fault.
Thank you, Ben. Huge fan. Would you say it's possible for the left to recognize broken families as one of the biggest problems in American society? And if so, what would it take for the left to realize how big of a problem this is?
Okay, so the left is never going to recognize that broken families are a problem because it is one of the goals of the left to break families. Historically speaking, if you read Marx and Engels, they do not like the traditional family. They think the traditional family is a bulwark against an overarching, brutal state. Right, so the idea is, and they want the overarching brutal state, so therefore they don't want the family. The family is a bunch of people who care about each other more than they care about the community at large. And so this is why in Soviet Russia, the chief goal was to separate children from their family, have them turn on their parents. I mean, some of the great Soviet heroes in the Soviet Union were kids who reported their parents to the authorities. Right? So the left has never been in favor of traditional families. They see it as a threat. Because traditional families don't vote according to how the left wants them to vote. They vote in favor of leave me alone. I've got my family. It's my job to protect them. So the left is never going to stand up in favor of that to the detriment of everybody involved. And therefore, it's incumbent on particularly religious people, because religion still has a significant amount of weight in American life, unlike in Europe. It's incumbent on religious people to make sure that their kids understand the value of family. It's incumbent on secular thinkers to make clear to people that broken homes, that single motherhood is not an affirmative good. And when Hollywood tells these lies, a great book by Charles Murray it's called Coming Apart, and it's actually about white poor people, white poverty versus white wealth. And he says one of the problems is a lot of people who exist in the white wealthy sphere, people in Hollywood, they live like traditionally religious people, but they preach like far leftists. So they'll be married, they'll have kids, they'll have the same divorce rate as kind of normal folks, but then they'll preach that all families are created equal. And look, this is not to say there can't be great single moms. There can. It's not to say there can't be crappy two-parent homes. Of course there can. But on a general level, if you're born into a two-parent family, you do have an advantage over people who are born into a one-parent family. It is everybody in this room's responsibility to live out these ideals, teach them to your kids, and teach them to all the people around you, regardless of race. Okay, and I understand there are people. I spoke at a school called Otay Ranch High School in San Diego, and it's a largely low-income minority crowd. I don't know how the public school approved it, but they did. And so I was speaking to them, and at one point I said exactly what I've said here. Single motherhood is a predictor of poverty, and if you're impoverished for all of your adult life in the United States, it's because you're not good with money. It's because you make bad decisions with your money. And the principal actually walked down and shut down the speech and excused the entire class if they wanted to leave, because he said there are too many kids here who are products of single mothers, and they might be offended. Okay, if you can't tell people the truth because they might be offended, we're never going to get anywhere here. So we have to tell people the truth regardless of whether it offends them, because the truth is the only thing that's going to make them more free and more prosperous.
Hear, hear.
Hi.
Howdy.
Fact number one. Transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychologists Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number two.
It's not
Rich
beautiful.
kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor.
It's not true.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining
I know.
where
Is there a
life
question
will
mark at
end
the
up.
end?
Fact number three, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my
depending on how
question
you
is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the three facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
Hey Ben, big fan. Two things. One, I'd like to call my brother Anders. Hey Anders, someone out there watching the live stream. Number two, I debate socialists all the time, and their only real comeback is, oh, that's not real socialism, or that's not real communism. Is there any way to really get around that and try to make them see that, look, just because your version of socialism, that magical fantasy land version of socialism, has not been tried, doesn't mean that socialism is an acceptable concept.
Yes. So the problem is that you're arguing with them in terms of the effectiveness of socialism. So what that argument is, you say socialism doesn't work, it fails everywhere, makes people poor and miserable, right? That's the argument. And then they go, but that's because it hasn't been properly tried, right? That's their comeback. So here is the actual argument that works with socialism. It is immoral to steal from people even if you vote to steal from people. Okay, if there are three people in a room, and it's me, and I have $100, and you and your friend are in the room, and you vote to beat me up and take my money, that does not make it morally legitimate for you to beat me up and take my money. One of the great lies that's been told about socialism, and you see this all the time, is people say socialism, beautiful idea in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. No, socialism is a shitty idea in theory, and it's an immoral idea in practice. Okay. Socialism violates at least 3 of the basic 10 commandments for those who still care. It makes government into God. It suggests that you can steal from people if you vote for it. And it says that it is good to be covetous of your neighbor's ass. Right? For Bill Clinton, it has a different meaning. But the problem for conservatives is we never actually argue on a moral level. We're constantly arguing on an effective level, on an efficiency level. And that's a problem because the left always argues on the moral level. In the end, they always say, sure, my ideas don't work, but they're fair. They're fair, right? And so what you have to say, the only way to come back to that from that is to say, no, your ideas are not fair, your ideas are theft. Your ideas are theft. You don't get to steal from other people just because you want their stuff. That's the only way to beat that argument. Do it on the moral level. Otherwise, they can always argue, well, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Okay, there's no way to come back from that because, again, they're operating in unicorn land with gumdrop rainbows and fairy skies. Thanks.
Hey, Ben, or I'm sorry, Your Grace.
Thank you. Thank you for not stealing my identity from me.
Yes, of course. I want to be polite here, obviously.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Respect the pronouns.
Yeah. One, how'd you become a Cubs fan? Or a White Sox fan? Yeah.
How dare you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Your Grace, please forgive me. Please forgive me. Pray for me tonight. 2, do I have the honor, Your Grace, to shake your hand? And then 3, how do we fix the education system in America? Because as you know, the K-12 system is really kind of falling apart in the inner cities. Our model is pretty much outdated. It's something that's been used since the 1920s.
Yeah.
Secondary education is also kind of what, as we just saw from the precious cupcakes outside.
Yeah.
If you major in lesbian dance theory, as you like to say,
yeah.
you get a $200,000 education and you can't get a job.
Right.
What do you think the solution be to that?
Okay, so first of all, on the White Sox question, my dad and mom are from Chicago. My dad was a White Sox fan. I inherited all of his rooting interests, and it's been a really bizarre year for me. I mean, really, between the Cubs winning the World Series and a reality TV show star winning the presidency, it's been interesting. So as far as shake my hand, be happy to do that if security allows it. And as far as the education system, the only answer in the education system is, of course, the same as it is in any other market-based system. You need a market. Right? If you grant vouchers, if you grant charter schools, if you pay teachers according to their product, if they perform better, you pay them more. If they don't perform, you fire them. Right? You actually have to have a free market system that involves local control because in the end, parents are going to be the ones who have to choose what's in the best interest of their child. It's also going to take a bit of civic re-education because the fact is that this has nothing to do with color. There are lots of miseducated kids in this country because education is not taken seriously in a lot of communities across the country. And so people are going to have to be told that, and they're going to have to learn that education matters a lot. And you can see this. I mean, in the Jewish community, education's always been a priority, and that's why Jews have always been very highly educated, regardless of the society in which they live. Americans have typically been highly educated, too, because we respect and value education. One of the ways to do that is by giving control back to the parents and making it their responsibility. The more government steps in, the more parents step out. And that's been true in every aspect of the private sector. The more government steps into welfare, the less people give charity. The more the government tries to regulate morality, the less the church does. Right? The fact is that the bigger government is, the less private choice there is, and private choice is the only way of guaranteeing quality of any product. When people declare a right to education, a right means that you have the ability to secure what you're looking for from somebody else, presumably. So if there's a right to education, I can force a teacher to teach my kid for free. There's no right to education. Okay, there's a right to seeking an education, and that's what we ought to focus on, is broadening the options for people who are seeking an education and ensuring that parents do a better job of that. And if parents won't get their kids an education, we have to talk seriously about whether that is misparenting in a severe enough way that you talk about, if the government steps in, if that's child abuse. If you just refuse to educate your child in any way, and if you don't care whether your kid's at your school, is that child abuse? I mean, we do have truancy laws in this country, and kids can't take care of themselves. Thanks.
Hi, Ben. Big fan. 2 things. 1, we're trending number 2 on Twitter right now, so that's cool.
That's awesome. All right.
My question...
Sorry, you're going to get the quick handshaker. Come on in, let's do it real fast. All right, dude.
Thank you. I love you. Big fan. My question is similar to the last one. It's where did this campus fanaticism come from, and how, if ever, does it end?
Okay, so the campus madness came about in the 1960s, and what happened is the same thing that happened to the entire 1960s generation, and that is a lot of people came back from World War II, and they said, we are going to protect our kids from all vicissitudes. We just went through the Great Depression and World War II. We are going to make the world safe for our kids. They're never going to have to experience hardship. And they did a wonderful job of that. They made the most prosperous country in world history, the most peaceful country in world history, and their kids grew up in the lap of luxury. And once you grow up in the lap of luxury, young people particularly are always looking for something to push back against. They're always looking for something to fight. And so they decided they had to fight the system. They had to fight injustices in the system. And some of the injustices they identified were real, like racial injustices or injustices based on sexism. And some of them were absolutely false, like the Vietnam War. Right? So the fact is that they were looking for something to rebel against. And the administrators simply let them have their way. The administrators simply said, OK, we'll cave before you, because obviously I think they were taken by surprise. And now those administrators have taken over the universities. Right? Now the kids took over the slots that they once occupied. They occupied the buildings. And then they became the professors. And now you have a self-perpetuating cycle, because in order for anybody in this room to get a doctorate in the social sciences, you personally have to go through the rigors of a leftist professor agreeing with your dissertation, right? So if you write a dissertation on why gun control is a failure, good luck trying to get somebody to sponsor that dissertation. So you've created this cycle. The only way to break that cycle is, once again, more options. And that's why I say that schools like Hillsdale College do a wonderful job, provide a wonderful alternative. The other thing that I say to college students is, in this particular case, you have no choice. And so if you have to play a leftist in order to become a professor, and then you can use your power against the system, do it. Right? So if you have to, when I was at UCLA, I graduated summa cum laude from UCLA and then cum laude from Harvard Law School. I didn't have to do this at Harvard, because Harvard was actually open to this stuff. But at UCLA, I had lots of professors who were very much to the left, and made pretty clear that if you disagreed with them, you were going to get graded down. And so I would always speak up in class, because we had blue books. I don't know if you guys still do blue books, but we had blue books, and you wrote your student ID number on it, not your name. So they had no clue who I was, right? So I would talk in class like the Republican conservative that I am, and then in my blue books, I would write like Bernie Sanders. And it worked beautifully. It worked beautifully. Straight A's from UCLA. And now the wonderful thing is they can't ever call me stupid, because I have degrees from their top institutions. So that's something that you may have to do in a liberal setting if you have no other choice, obviously.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro, for coming. I've just been informed we are trending #1 on Twitter.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah. So
Nice.
my question.
Thank you to the protesters.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. If you ever debate Milo Yiannopoulos on campus, I'm sure I'll be rooting for you, and I'm sure we'd all love to see that. The day after election was a national day of mourning across campus. Chalk drawings galore, as much as they can. And anyone that I've brought up, I sat in the front row here, and I had in my biology lecture that was canceled to talk about our feelings about the election. Unbelievable. And one person noticed that I was looking up the Wisconsin, see what happened in Wisconsin after election night, and he said, "You're not going to like the numbers." And I said, "Well, I'm a conservative. I voted for Trump."
Like numbers, yeah.
And he got up and he sat 3 rows back. No words against me. But and then he stood up for 15 minutes talking about his feelings. But I was wondering, how are we able to engage in a conversation where, Madison is such an echo chamber for liberalism?
I mean, first of all, not every conversation is engageable, obviously. You can't follow the guy to the back of the room and start talking about why your vote was worthwhile and why it's great that the most corrupt woman ever to attempt to run for the Oval Office doesn't now occupy it. Right? And by the way, again, this is coming from a guy who didn't support Trump in the primaries or the general. Right? I didn't vote for Trump or Hillary. Neither of them met my minimum definition of people who deserve to be president. But I am certainly very, very, very pleased that Hillary Clinton is not president of the United States, and that Donald Trump apparently vanquished her with a bucket of water. Like that was so that. But I think that it is worthwhile. I think that it is very much worthwhile to consider in every conversation what's the purpose of the conversation. So I would speak to somebody on the left who wants to have an honest conversation in a different way than I would speak to people who are standing up here shouting at me. If you're standing up here shouting at me, I can't have that conversation when I'm on my deathbed. Hopefully many, many years from now, I'm going to look back and go, God, I really wish I had those 10 minutes back where I was trying to talk to the idiot shouting safety at me. Right? So you have to gauge what's the purpose of the conversation, whether it's worthwhile or not. And then if it is worthwhile, then bring facts and figures and consider whether the other person might have a point, because sometimes the people on the left do have points that you should consider and maybe change your opinion on, maybe not. But you can have open and honest but you have to determine at the beginning what's the purpose of the conversation. When I'm debating somebody, the purpose of the conversation is not for me to convince the person I'm debating, it's to convince the people in the audience, which means I have to destroy the person I'm debating. It is morally incumbent on me to go full Terminator. So So, with that guy, you're not going to be able to have a conversation with him. Hopefully, you'll identify people who actually want to have open and honest conversations that are useful.
Thank you. Appreciate your hand.
Absolutely. So much love, guys. This is great.
Hi. I apologize for not knowing who you are, and I'm tired if anybody doesn't know that. Sorry.
Well, thank you for coming, even though you don't know who I was. Did you kind of like stumble in here?
I barely walked in. I was wondering, how old are you?
I'm 32.
Okay. Well, then I am twice the age of most, unless you're over 30 and still in college. I would like to speak to your mama. Like I said, I run a food pantry and soup kitchen.
Thank you for doing that.
That's fine. For like 11 years. I've noticed that over the years, we have given more than we expect of the people. The people that come to the food pantries and the soup kitchen do not put any time. My volunteers come from all over the place, but they do not come from the people who are using the sector.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way you think that morally we have changed to not make it? It's never shameful to need help. I mean, I've been married for 35 years.
Yeah.
We've lived in a van. I mean, we've worked our way up to living in a beautiful home. So I'm not saying
That's great.
I'm just saying, when did it become, shameful's not the right word.
Yes. No. When did the stigma disappear about without repaying it, taking aid?
Or at least being grateful?
Yeah, or at least being grateful. Yes. I mean, honestly, I think it's when the government got involved. I think when the government decided to replace private people in providing these services, people started to think it's owed to me, right? This is why these things are now called entitlements, right? They used to be called privileges, or they used to be called benefits, but now they're called entitlements. You are entitled to them by virtue of the fact that you're here. Now, nobody's entitled to use of your food pantry, right? But people see it as an entitlement because they've been taught from the time they're young that in America you're entitled to certain basic things, and if you don't provide them for yourself, then you'll just go get them somewhere else and never repay it. In Jewish morality, which I rarely cite, but in Jewish morality, there's a basic injunction, and that is every single person has to give charity. Every single person. It doesn't matter how poor you are. Even if you are a poor person, even if you are dead poor, even if you're dead broke, as Hillary Clinton once was, even if you're dead broke, you actually do have to give charity. It's incumbent on you as a human being, not because your charity is actually going to help somebody that much you're poor, but because it makes you a better person. Charity is about the giver, not just the recipient. And in America, unfortunately, we've come to the conclusion that charity, welfare, unemployment benefits, all the benefits provided by the government, these benefits are only and solely for the benefit of the person who is taking. They're not for the benefit of the person who is giving as well. And the more government takes, the more it feels like it's not a matter of morality for me to give to poor people. It's a matter of they're going to put me in jail if I don't. And so if there's nobody there with a gun, the social science showed this, by the way. Like you read child rearing books, and one of the things that they say is you actually shouldn't give an allowance to kids to do normal chores if you want them to do normal chores, right? If you give them an allowance, they start to think, oh, I'm supposed to be paid to do these things, right? If you actually say to them, no, you're obligated to do these things, and now you get a normal allowance for doing other stuff or just unrelated to these chores, then they'll do the chores with alacrity. In America, we've given that up. In America, we've given up the idea that you are obligated to do certain things as a citizen in a republic because government says we're going to force you to do it or you're going to be punished for doing it. And voluntarism is the name of the game here. And as voluntarism disintegrates, so does the social fabric. You can't trust your neighbor because obviously the only reason your neighbor is being nice to you is because the cops might come if they're not.
Hi, Ben. Sorry that representatives from the People's Republic of Madison treated you with such disrespect.
Oh, but other representatives treated me so well. Thanks, guys.
So yesterday on how Trump's going to pick his cabinet members to the Bachelor, so ultimately...
Because of his tweet. He tweeted out, for those who missed it, Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, tweeted out something to the effect of, I am the only one who knows who my final picks will be. Right, and he said who the finalists will be. It was actually the finalists. He said, it's not a mess, it's not chaos. I'm the only one who knows who my finalists will be. And so I tweeted out something like in all capital letters, who will get the rose?
So ultimately, my question is, who do you think will be the most qualified and competent people? I know you've been talking about how Bolton would be a
fantastic as
qualified
Secretary
choice for Secretary of State.
Yeah.
But for other people, who do you think should get the rose in terms?
I mean, so he's mentioning some good. So I do on my podcast. I do a segment called "Good Trump, Bad Trump," and I've been doing it for months, and now I get to do it for years on end. And that's the thing with Trump. He's a total mixed bag. Like, you don't know, you put your hand in that bag and you don't know whether you're going to get a rose or dog do. Like, it could be anything. That's what makes it so spicy. And so he'll say things like, maybe I'll consider making Rudy Giuliani the Secretary of State. I like Rudy Giuliani, but his experience with international policy is limited to the fact that he lived a few miles from the UN at one point. And then he'll mention Michelle Rhee as Secretary of Education, which would be great. Right? Michelle Rhee would be excellent as Secretary of Education. Bolton would be excellent as Secretary of State. He mentioned Kelly Ayotte for Secretary of Defense. She'd be just fine. Right? Then sometimes he just mentions like crazy out of the woodwork ideas that I don't understand in the slightest. Right? So we'll have to wait and see. Of course, he only knows the finalists. And the reality show editors have not edited it in the back room yet to make it look like this was all planned. My mom is a reality TV show producer. That's how they do it, gang. There are some good people that he's discussing. As I've said to others, I didn't vote for Trump. I'm still hoping for the best. He's the president-elect of the United States. I would like to see him do all of the things that conservatives want him to do and keep many of the promises that he made. I'd like him to forget about the ones about universal health care at one point and about tariffs and about wanting to go on a honeymoon with Vladimir Putin. But if you can leave those ones behind, then I would like him to give us a good Supreme Court justice. I would like for him to repeal Obamacare. I would like for him to lower taxes. There are lots of good things he can get done. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to wait and see. This is actually the hard point, right? Once we get to January 20th and he takes over, which, by the way, the sight of Obama having to give up for Trump is just magnificent. It's just magnificent. And it wouldn't be, I didn't vote for him, and it would be nothing, it's the greatest justice imaginable for Barack Obama, who thinks he's this great God King wisdom figure, this merger between MLK and Jesus. If you saw the pictures of him with Trump in the Oval Office, it's my favorite picture in human history. It's a picture of Trump, and he's giving the Trump finger to the press, right? And then next to him is Barack Obama sitting straight up, looking into the distance. It looks like he's got a ramrod straight up his ass. And you can almost see the steel behind his eyes. It's that far up. But the capper to the photo, it's the greatest thing in the world. The capper to the photo is in the background on Obama's left, is a bust of Abraham Lincoln going like this. And it's just great because it says everything about this election. But the idea that Obama, who considers himself this wonderful guy, but was really just a celebrity, right? He was just a celebrity reality TV star, being faced with the actuality that he's going to be replaced by another reality TV star who he was joking about on Jimmy Kimmel like 3 years ago, saying he'll never be president. It's pretty spectacular. So we can at least be entertained. But on January 21st, we'll actually know what this looks like. I'm eager to get there because I want to know whether I was right or wrong about Trump. I hope I was wrong. I was wrong about his electability, obviously. So I hope that I'm also wrong about him as a president. I pray that I'm wrong about him as a president, or it's going to be a long 4 years.
Mr. Shapiro, as you may or may not know, last year, 80 Silicon Valley executives sent a letter to North Carolina expressing their strong discontent for their transgender segregation bathrooms or whatever. Basically, boys go to boys' bathrooms.
Yes.
Girls go to, so for those of us that are going into tech or the private industries, how do we push for a global economy, or I guess at this point, an American economy that's more conservative and actually has the values that we would like to work for?
Yeah, I mean, power and money are the name of the game. And this is why I say you have to make choices knowing the industry that you're going into, how much you're willing to compromise your own values in order to go into that industry and become successful. I'm lucky enough that I get to be in an industry where my legitimate job is just speaking my mind every day, which is a pretty wonderful thing. But most people don't. I mean, my mom works in Hollywood. That means that she doesn't get to talk politics at the office, and it means that she has to kind of keep her mouth shut when it comes to issues like this. In the end, the people who have the money and the firing power are the ones who are going to be able to determine the future. It's also worthwhile noting, by the way, that conservatives ought to start using their marketing power in the way that the left has used their market power. So the left tries to boycott North Carolina, right, as you mentioned, because they don't like the policy. Well, conservatives should boycott those companies, right? But conservatives should say, well, if you're going to discriminate against North Carolina, we're not shopping with you. Right? If you're going to say to Brendan Eich, the CEO of Mozilla Firefox, that he has to be fired because he supports traditional marriage, then we should say, okay, no one's going to download Mozilla Firefox, and you're going to take a hit in your stock price. That's actually happening now with Grubhub, right? The Grubhub CEO said that he was going to discriminate against Trump employees, people who voted for Trump and were employees, and the stock price has dropped like $6 in the last 72 hours. The NFL, I think, is taking a major hit specifically because of this. I think Colin Kaepernick and the Black Lives Matter movement, it's turned off an entire audience. People who used to think, it's a Sunday, I'm just going to turn on the TV and watch a football game. They think, I don't want to lecture on how America's racist and awful, or Bob Costa's telling me about gun control. Screw it. I'll just watch a rerun of the Dick Van Dyke Show or something. So Americans, conservatives need to start using their power in the market as well.
Hi, Ben. Thank you.
Howdy. You make me feel really underdressed.
I think this ideology of, social justice and victimhood ultimately is Marxism.
Yes.
And as someone who came from Venezuela escaping communism, you can imagine the terror that I feel, when I see the state of the media and academia, and given the Democratic nomination, also politics. So my question to you is, why does Marxism refuse to die?
Marxism refuses to die because Marxism gives people a utopia to live for. There's a great book called Secondhand Time that I'm reading right now, which is kind of an oral history of the Soviet Union. It's from all these people who were, it just won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2015. Great book. I highly recommend it. And it's all these people who lived through the Soviet Union and then the fall of the Soviet Union, and all these people who were really excited when the Soviet Union fell, but now it's been replaced by Putin's Russia, and they're nostalgic for the Soviet Union again. They want Stalin back. Stalin shirts are still selling out in Russia, where people's ancestors were being murdered. And there's a book by Daniel Jurgen and Joseph Stanislaw called The Commanding Heights. It came out in 1999. And what they said is, by the end of the decade of the 90s, capitalism had defeated communism. But they said communism will come back, socialism will come back. And the reason is because in the 1930s, look at the Spanish Civil War, people were dying from the communist side. In the Spanish Civil War, it was communist versus fascist. People on the communist side were dying with the words, this was the rumor anyway, Stalin on their lips. Nobody dies with the words free markets on their lips. Nobody dies with the words nice house on their lips. And the fact is that because American conservatives have not pitched our case in terms of morality and decency and what's right and wrong and what's good and bad, we've instead pitched our case in terms of, look, here's some nice stuff. That's not a winning message. George Orwell wrote a fantastic essay. You should go back and look it up. It's the single best political essay ever written. 1940, he writes about why does Adolf Hitler's Germany rise? Why are young people signing up for Nazism when it clearly is such a flawed philosophy, deeply evil, guaranteeing blood and pain, right? And what he says is, what we here in the West don't understand is that nice houses and decent cars and enough food to eat, all of that's nice enough, but there's still a yearning in the human soul for something more. There's a yearning in the human soul for flag flying, and there's a yearning in the human soul for the sound of guns, right? I mean, there's a yearning in the human soul to fight for something, to make your life matter. Now, as religion declines in the West, and this has been one of the major factors, people don't find their meaning anymore in the idea that I am doing something good on behalf of my fellow man. Instead, they say, I need a utopia to belong to. I need a communal cause to identify with. That's why you see people marching in the streets. That's why you wouldn't see one of these kids who's doing this before stand up and do this by himself, right? You need a bunch of people to do it together. It's important because now you're part of something larger and you're brave and you're special. Right? You wouldn't do it as an individual. As an individual, you could actually have a conversation. But you're virtuous by membership in this clique. So the reason communism will rise again and is rising again and Marxism is rising again is because it says we're more moral, we will provide a utopia, and you can be part of building that utopia no matter how miserable you are. It doesn't matter if we dragged your parents off and killed them in the gulags. All that matters is that you were part of something great, that you were part of something wonderful, right? And that's not what America is. America says it's your job to be a wonderful person. It's your job to take care of your family. You want to make America great again, okay? The way to do that is by making yourself and your family great again. The way to do that is by being a decent person, independent of trying to grab the levers of government and use them to shape humanity. That's what the founders thought making America great in the first place was all about. But we have to make that moral argument. We can never stop making that moral argument. And the more we make the argument that our policies just make you richer, people don't care. People don't care, especially in a rich country. In a poor country, people care. Right? In a rich country, it's all fun and games because we can talk until the cows come home about social justice, so long as we get to go home and sleep at night in our nice warm bed sponsored by the state at a top university. But it's a lot harder to talk about social justice when you're eating dogs because you have nothing else to eat, as they are in Venezuela because all the shelves are empty. Thanks so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this will be the last question.
Yes, and that transgender that grabbed you by the neck might be a direct result because people didn't listen to me. I'm the only person in 2003 that fought the International Olympic Committee over transgenders, and then it spread to I sat with Jenner in 1976 before he set the record. And then it spread to the state high school leagues, and obviously it's going to go to the Supreme Court here. You know, the bathroom bill, so I have a long history. I've taken the NBA on, NFL, all the major leagues teams. My question is, where is this all going to end up?
Well, I mean, the left always needs a new civil rights movement because all of them remember when they were actually in the right on civil rights in the 1960s. So they're constantly comparing everything to civil rights. Right? Gay rights are civil rights. Transgender rights are civil rights. It's always the next thing is just like when we were marching on behalf of black folks back in the 1960s. And so after they obliterate gender, obliterate sex as a meaningful distinction, which is obviously silliness. You got the NBA boycotting North Carolina, or the NCAA boycotting North Carolina, but they still have separate men's and women's divisions, which is weird. Right? If sex is just arbitrary, then why do you have women's divisions? Why can't it just be a bunch of 6'8" dudes who weigh 300 pounds, you know, banging around in the paint with a bunch of 5'3" women, right? But the only way to, I think that the next step for the left, I've always said this, is taking their agenda and destroying the religious right. And so this has always been the purpose of, for example, same-sex marriage. I personally am libertarian on same-sex marriage. I think the government should not be a part of marriage, period. I think the government has nothing to do with it. And that's not because I'm morally for same-sex marriage. I'm not. I don't think that homosexuality is I'm a religious person. You know, as a religious Jew, I believe there's such thing as sinful and not sinful. That doesn't mean that's public policy, right? Public policy is different than that. So when it comes to public policy, my feeling is that the government is really crappy at everything and hasn't promoted traditional marriage in any real way. When they tried to, it failed. Obviously, the government can't be the barrier between marriage and failure. That just doesn't work. I have personally 2 marriage certificates, right? I have the one from the state that I don't care about and it got lost sometime and I don't care. And then there's my Jewish marriage certificate, which is my ketubah, right? And that's the one that I cared about because it's the one that said I could have sex with my wife. And for religious people, by the way, that's how this works. If you go to the state and get your marriage license, that doesn't mean a lot unless you have a pastor, give the go-ahead. So the reality is that the state really has nothing to do with the marital institution. The only reason the state ever got involved was supposedly to promote procreation. The state has failed dramatically. So I want the state out of that entirely. But what the left is going to do is they're going to use the government-imposed same-sex marriage rulings in order to break every church in America. They're going to take schools, religious schools, and they're going to shut them down if they don't respect same-sex marriage. They're going to say if you don't educate your kids about the wonders of same-sex marriage, then you are discriminating against gay people and maybe against your own kid because you never know, they could be gay. Right? They're going to say that every church, every school, every religious institution in America must be discriminated against if they do not participate in whatever the left social agenda of the day is. And that's a much larger battle than all of these secondary silly battles about bathrooms in North Carolina and such. The left is always on attack. And because they're always on attack, it's incumbent on us to always fight back. We can never stop fighting back. And obviously not just fighting back, dismantling the roots of their agenda, exposing them for what they are, a bunch of people who are grasping and ambitious, a philosophy, more than a bunch of people, a philosophy that says your labor is not your own, your time is not your own, your freedom is not your own. Your labor, your time, and your freedom are all your own. And it is your job to use them to best effect. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.